welcome back to No Apologies. So today we're going to address just another objection that is sometimes raised concerning the Gospel of John, chapter 6, and that is that sometimes the verses which take place just after our Lord's teaching of the Eucharist, verse 60 and following, are pointed to and are claimed to be where our Lord explained that He was only speaking symbolically. In verses 60 through 65 it reads, "Many of His disciples, when they heard it, said, 'This is a hard saying, who can listen to it?' But Jesus, knowing in Himself that His disciples murmured at it, said to them, 'Do you take offense at this? And what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where He was before? It is the Spirit that gives life, the flesh is of no avail. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life, but there are some of you that do not believe.' For Jesus knew from the first who those were that did not believe, and who it was that should betray Him. And He said, 'This is why I told you, that no one can come to me, unless it is granted him by the Father.'" Of those verses, usually verse 63 is pointed to and held up as the proof text that that was what our Lord was doing. He says that it is the Spirit that gives life, the flesh is of no avail. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But we say that that's not at all what our Lord was doing. And the error comes from pulling that verse, 63, out of its context. If we look closely at the Eucharistic discourse, we can see that our Lord's teaching of the Eucharist actually ends on verse 59. It reads that this He said in the synagogue in Capernaum. So what follows takes place at some time later. The point being that our Lord is no longer teaching about the Eucharist directly. His teaching is finished. Now He goes on to challenge those who heard Him to believe in His teaching. And these verses, verse 60 through following, really only make sense if they're read in the light of that context, faith. So if we begin at verse 61 in the context of faith, "But Jesus, knowing in Himself that His disciples murmured at it, said to them, 'Do you take offense at this? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where He was before?'" So what if we were to see Jesus ascended into heaven, if we were to see Him with His humanity unveiled as He truly is, the second person of the Trinity, true God? Then would we take offense at His words, or then would we be able to believe His words? So then He continues, "It is the Spirit, faith, that gives life. The flesh, what we see and what we experience with our own senses, or what we try to understand or comprehend with our own human reasoning, is of no avail. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life." So He's saying that it's only faith in His words, only faith in the words of the Son of God, which can bring us to a belief in the true presence of the Eucharist. It's not a reliance upon our own flesh, upon our human reasoning, upon our human senses. And this faith is a work of grace. That is why He continues in verse 65, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father." And secondly, we would point out that in the Eucharistic discourse, our Lord refers to the flesh as my flesh, whereas in these latter verses, He refers to it as the flesh, confirming that He is speaking of something different here. And no Christian would say that our Lord would say that His own flesh is of no avail, or it is that very flesh which was the cause of our own salvation. Then lastly, we would point out that our Lord's disciples actually leave Him in verse 66. So if verse 63 was where our Lord went and explained that He meant symbolically, then it doesn't make sense that His disciples would still leave later on. So for those three reasons, we say that the verses 60 through following don't prove that our Lord was speaking symbolically. The interpretation isn't being faithful to the context. Our Lord refers to the Eucharist as my flesh, whereas here He says the flesh. And lastly, it doesn't make sense that His disciples would still leave if He in fact corrected them and said He was speaking symbolically. So thanks for joining me here on No Apologies. Ave Maria.